Remember when Friday nights meant TGIF? Airport goodbyes happened at the gate, and everyone knew the Macarena? The 70s through the 90s gave us unforgettable trends, tech, and pop culture moments. Some legendary, some laughable, all gone forever. Let's take a nostalgic trip back to the things we'll never see again, but we'll never forget. Hitchhiking. Back in the 1970s, if you didn't have a car, it wasn't a big deal. All you had to do was stand by the road, stick out your thumb, and wait for a friendly driver to offer you a lift. It was an easy and free way to travel, especially for young, adventurous spirits who wanted to explore without the burden of bus schedules or cab fares. But over time, hitchhiking started to fade away. Safety became a huge concern. The rise of crime stories in the news, along with terrifying movies like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, made people think twice before hopping into a stranger's car or picking up a stranger themselves. Eventually, hitchhiking nearly disappeared as people turned to safer transportation options. Schoolhouse Rock. Saturday mornings in the 1970s and 80s were all about lounging in front of the TV with a big bowl of sugary cereal, watching cartoons that were pure fun. No lessons, no homework, just entertainment. But Schoolhouse Rock found a clever way to sneak in some learning without kids even realizing it. With its catchy songs and fun animations, it taught everything from multiplication and American history to grammar and civics. Before you knew it, kids across the country could sing about conjunctions, interjections, and even explain how a bill becomes a law, all without ever opening a textbook. It was a rare blend of education and entertainment that stuck with a generation. But sadly, educational programming like this has mostly disappeared from Saturday mornings. Pull tabs on cans. Back in the 1970s, cracking open a soda or beer wasn't as simple as it is today. Instead of a stay-on tab, you had to yank a metal ring that peeled back a wedge-shaped opening on the top of the can. The problem? That sharp little tab was completely detachable, and people tossed them everywhere. Sidewalks, parks, and beaches were littered with them, turning those tiny scraps of metal into a real hazard. Countless people ended up with cuts on their feet just from walking barefoot. It became such a problem that by the early 1980s, a safer alternative was introduced: the stay tab, which remains attached to the can after opening. Just like that, the era of discarded pull tabs came to an end. TV sign-offs and test patterns. Back in the 1970s, television wasn't a 24/7 affair. If you stayed up too late, you'd eventually run out of things to watch. Instead of endless reruns or infomercials, stations would simply sign off for the night. You'd see a test pattern, a strange, colorful graphic on the screen, sometimes accompanied by an annoying tone. Other times, stations would end their broadcast with something patriotic, like the national anthem playing over an image of the American flag. But after that, just static. Night owls had no choice but to call it a night. It wasn't until the rise of cable television in the 80s and 90s that TV became a non-stop, around-the-clock experience, making test patterns a thing of the past. Oversized collars. Fashion in the 1970s was all about making a statement, and nothing screamed stylish louder than massive, exaggerated collars. These weren't your average shirt collars. They were wide, floppy, and often extended far beyond the shoulders. Men's fashion embraced this look with fitted shirts, leisure suits, and even jackets featuring these dramatic lapels. And if you were really on trend, you'd pop that shirt collar right over your jacket for extra flair. Bonus points if your shirt was unbuttoned just enough to show off a hairy chest and a gold chain. This bold style was everywhere, on disco dance floors, in casual wear, and even in business attire. But like all trends, it eventually faded. making way for the sleeker, more understated styles of the 1980s. 1970s, sideburns. Sideburns weren't just facial hair in the 1970s, they were a full-on fashion statement. What started as a rebellious counterculture trend in the late 50s and 60s exploded into the mainstream by the early 70s, with men growing them out to near Civil War proportions. These weren't just subtle trims along the jawline, they were bold, bushy, and often extended down to the chin. Icons like Richard Roundtree, Burt Reynolds, and of course, Elvis Presley made thick sideburns a signature look. Whether paired with a mustache or left on their own, they symbolized rugged masculinity and effortless cool. 1970s, upholstery. If you walked into a living room in the 1970s, chances are you'd be greeted by a sofa that practically shouted for attention. Upholstery during this decade wasn't about subtlety. It was all about bold, eye-catching patterns. Oversized floral prints, geometric designs, and swirling shapes covered couches in shades of brown, orange, and avocado green. These statement pieces weren't just furniture. They were a key part of the home's overall aesthetic, blending perfectly with shag carpets, wood-paneled walls, and heavy drapes. It was a look that defined the era, warm, cozy, and unmistakably 70s. But as interior design moved towards sleeker, more muted styles in the 1980s, those loud, patterned sofas slowly disappeared, making way for more understated home decor. 1970s, compact cars. The 1973 oil crisis changed the way Americans thought about cars. With gas prices skyrocketing, those big, gas-guzzling vehicles of the past became too expensive to keep on the road. Enter the era of compact cars, small, fuel-efficient, and, unfortunately, not the most stylish. Models like the Ford Pinto, AMC Gremlin, and AMC Pacer were designed to save money at the pump, but they sacrificed looks in the process. With their awkward shapes and odd proportions, they quickly earned a reputation for being some of the ugliest cars on the road. While they served their purpose for a time, automakers soon realized their mistakes. By 1980, all three were discontinued, paving the way for more refined and stylish compact cars in the decades to come. Disco era. The disco era may have been brief, but its impact on the 1970s was undeniable. What began in underground clubs in New York City quickly became a nationwide sensation, transforming music, dance, and fashion. The release of Saturday Night Fever in 1977 sent disco into overdrive, turning John Travolta into a style icon and filling dance floors with people eager to perfect their moves under the glow of a mirrored disco ball. Suddenly, everyone was grooving to the beats of ABBA, Donna Summer, The Village People, and, of course, the Bee Gees. The flashy outfits, platform shoes, and shimmering jumpsuits became just as iconic as the music itself. Though disco eventually faded, its legacy still lives on in pop culture, reminding us of a time when the dance floor was king. Streaking. Of all the wild trends to come out of the 1970s, streaking might just be the most bizarre. The idea was simple: strip down completely and run through a public place, usually for laughs and shock value. It started as a college prank, but quickly took over the country, with streakers popping up at sporting events, concerts, and even live TV broadcasts. By the mid-70s, it had reached its peak, becoming so popular that novelty products like streaking-themed t-shirts and gag gifts flooded the market. The craze even inspired The Streak, a hit comedy song by Ray Stevens that perfectly captured the absurdity of it all. Slide projector shows. Before smartphones and social media, sharing vacation photos was a much more interactive experience, whether you wanted it to be or not. If your neighbors went on a trip in the 1970s, there was a good chance you'd be invited over for a slide show. They'd dim the lights, load their vacation slides into a bulky carousel projector, and click through every single photo, one by one, while delivering long-winded stories about each shot. The projector's hum filled the room, dust floated through the light beam, and every so often, a slide would pop up upside down, adding to the awkwardness. It was a social obligation few could escape, but thankfully, with the rise of digital photography, this tedious tradition eventually faded away. What's one thing from the 70s that you wish would make a comeback? Spuds MacKenzie. In 1987, during Super Bowl 22, the world was introduced to a new pop culture sensation, Spuds MacKenzie, the ultimate party animal. This laid-back, sunglasses-wearing bull terrier quickly became the face of Bud Light, exuding effortless cool and living the high life surrounded by beautiful women. Spuds wasn't just a commercial star, his image was everywhere, on t-shirts, bumper stickers, posters, and even toys. For a brief moment, he was one of the most recognizable mascots of the decade, but like many 80s icons, controversy wasn't far behind. The biggest twist? Spuds MacKenzie was actually a female dog named Honeytree Evil Eye. Despite the scandal, Spuds remained an unforgettable part of 80s advertising history before fading into nostalgia. The mullet. The mullet was the hairstyle of the 1980s, bold, rebellious, and impossible to ignore. Worn by both men and women, it was defined by its signature contrast, short and neat in the front, long and wild in the back. This business in the front, party in the back style was embraced by pop culture icons like Rob Lowe, Patrick Swayze, and tennis star Andre Agassi, making it a must-have look for anyone wanting to channel effortless cool. Whether paired with ripped denim, a leather jacket, or a neon windbreaker, the mullet was a statement of pure 80s attitude. Though the style eventually faded, it left an undeniable mark on the decade and still pops up today as a nostalgic, ironic fashion choice. Trapper Keeper. If you were a student in the 1980s, having a Trapper Keeper wasn't just about staying organized, it was about showing off your style. These ultra-cool binders had everything built in: folders, a clipboard, a pencil pouch, and that satisfying Velcro flap that made opening it feel like unlocking a secret weapon. The covers came in all sorts of eye-catching designs, from neon geometric patterns to dreamy landscapes, making it feel like a personalized school essential. Every kid either had one or desperately wanted one, but as the years went on, their bulky plastic frames, limited storage space, and small 1-inch rings just couldn't keep up. By the 90s, they were mostly replaced by larger, more practical binders, but they remain a beloved piece of 80s nostalgia. Potpourri. Back in the 1980s, no home was complete without at least one decorative bowl of potpourri. In fact, there were usually several scattered around the house, on coffee tables, in bathrooms, and even tucked inside dresser drawers. These colorful mixtures of dried flower petals, fruits, and spices weren't just for decoration. They filled the air with sweet, lingering fragrances, long before plug-in air fresheners and scented candles took over. Lavender, rose, cinnamon. Each blend offered a different scent to match the mood of the room. And if you were ever stumped on a gift for mom, potpourri was the answer. Parachute pants. In the 1980s, if you wanted to breakdance, you needed the right gear. Enter parachute pants. Made from lightweight, swishy nylon, these skin-tight pants became a must-have for dancers and street performers looking to spin, slide, and pop with ease. Companies like Bugle Boy made them famous, with their multiple zippers and futuristic, almost metallic look. By the mid-80s, these slim-fitting pants were everywhere, embraced by breakdancers and trendsetters alike. But as the decade progressed, fashion shifted. The tight style gave way to the loose, ultra-baggy pants made famous by MC Hammer, perfect for busting out moves like the Running Man. Boomboxes. In the 1980s, if you wanted to take your music anywhere and make sure everyone heard it, you needed a boombox. These oversized portable stereos were built for volume, blasting music loud enough to turn any sidewalk, park, or street corner into a party. More than just a music player, a boombox could record radio stations, play cassette tapes, and even mix tracks, making it an essential tool in the rise of hip-hop and breakdancing culture. Carrying one on your shoulder became a status symbol, but as their popularity grew, so did noise complaints. By the late 80s, boomboxes started fading as personal headphones and Walkmans took over. Still, they left a lasting mark, especially with the unforgettable Say Anything scene where John Cusack held one high, cementing the boombox as a true pop culture icon. Milk carton kids. Long before Amber Alerts and social media, the faces of missing children appeared on something nearly every household had: the milk carton. It all started in the early 1980s when an Iowa dairy company printed a missing child's photo on its packaging. The idea quickly spread, and soon, breakfast tables across America featured somber black and white images of lost children, turning milk cartons into a nationwide bulletin board. While the campaign raised awareness, it also sparked fear, especially among kids eating their morning cereal. Unfortunately, it didn't prove very effective in actually locating missing children. Over time, people became desensitized to the images, and the campaign quietly faded away, replaced by more immediate and widespread alert systems like the Amber Alert. What's a nostalgic memory from your childhood that younger generations will never experience? Kmart's Blue Light Special. If you ever shopped at Kmart in the 1980s, you knew the excitement of the Blue Light Special. At any moment, a flashing blue police-style light would pop up in the store, and an announcement would echo through the aisles. Attention, Kmart shoppers. That meant one thing: a limited-time deal was happening right now. Shoppers would rush over, eager to snag a bargain before the light went off. At its peak, Kmart was the king of discount shopping, and the Blue Light Special became part of pop culture. But as retail giants like Walmart rose to dominance, Kmart struggled to keep up. The once iconic promotion faded away, much like the chain itself, becoming just another nostalgic memory of the golden age of bargain shopping. Nintendo Power Glove. Few video game accessories have ever been as hyped or as disappointing as the Nintendo Power Glove. Released in 1989, this futuristic-looking controller had kids across America dreaming of a new way to play. It wasn't just advertised in commercials, it was showcased in the movie The Wizard, which made it look like the ultimate gaming gadget. The sleek robotic design and motion controls promised a revolutionary experience. The reality? It was clunky, frustrating, and barely worked as intended. Despite all the excitement, the Power Glove sold poorly, and after just a short time, it faded into obscurity. Bartles and Jaymes wine coolers. In 1981, E. and J. Gallo introduced Bartles and Jaymes wine coolers, and by the mid-1980s, they had become the drink of choice for young adults looking for something sweeter and lighter than beer. What really made them stand out, though, was their quirky ad campaign. Two fictional soft-spoken porch dwellers, Frank Bartles and Ed Jaymes, charmed audiences with their slow, folksy endorsements, thanking customers for their support with a straight-faced sincerity that became their signature. By 1988, their popularity had skyrocketed, even landing them a coveted Super Bowl ad. At their peak, they were as iconic as Spuds MacKenzie and the "Where's the beef wire" lady. But like most trends, wine coolers eventually faded, and by the early 90s, Bartles and Jaymes was just another relic of the decade's pop culture boom. VHS tapes. By the early 1990s, The VHS tape was a household staple, transforming how people watched movies at home. Almost every family had a VCR, and with it came stacks of bulky VHS tapes, whether store-bought or recorded straight from TV. Video rental shops were booming, letting us bring home the latest blockbusters for a weekend movie night, just as long as we remembered to rewind before returning them. Fast-forwarding through previews and dealing with the occasional tape that got eaten by the VCR was all part of the experience. But as much as we loved them, VHS tapes had their limitations. By the late 90s, the rise of DVDs, with their sharper picture quality and no need to rewind, sealed the fate of VHS, turning them into nostalgic relics of a bygone era. Floppy disks. In the 1990s, as personal computers became more common in households, people needed a way to store and transfer files easily. Enter the floppy disk, a small, square, plastic-covered storage device that quickly became a must-have for computer users everywhere. These 3.5-inch disks were the go-to solution for saving documents, software, and even early computer games. Almost every desk had a stack of them, labeled with everything from school essays to business spreadsheets. While they only held a small amount of data by today's standards, they were revolutionary at the time. But as technology advanced, floppy disks couldn't keep up. By the early 2000s, they were replaced by CDs, USB drives, and eventually, cloud storage, turning them into just another nostalgic memory of the digital age. Dial-up internet. If there's one sound that instantly transports you back to the mid-1990s, it's the screeching, beeping symphony of a dial-up modem connecting to the internet. Back then, AOL ruled the online world, and logging in meant hearing that unmistakable noise, followed by the exciting, "You've got mail" greeting. But getting online wasn't instant. It took patience. And once you were connected, the phone line was off limits. If someone in the house picked up the phone, your connection would drop, sending you right back to square one. It was a frustrating but unforgettable part of early internet life. As broadband took over in the 2000s, dial-up faded into history, but for those who lived through it, that nostalgic sound remains a symbol of the internet's early days. Beanie Babies. Few toy crazes in the 1990s were as intense or as financially hyped as Beanie Babies. What started as a simple $5 plush toy for kids quickly turned into a nationwide obsession. Certain rare Beanie Babies skyrocketed in value, with collectors paying thousands for the most sought-after ones. People scoured toy stores, flea markets, and gift shops in hopes of finding a hidden gem that could make them rich. Even McDonald's got involved, releasing teeny beanies in Happy Meals, which became instant collectibles. But like most fads, the bubble eventually burst. By the late 90s, Beanie Babies lost their magic, and once priceless collectibles were being sold in bargain bins, proving that not every craze turns into a fortune. Please comment 1 to let me know you'll be watching this video until the end. Pagers. Before everyone had a cell phone in their pocket, the pager was the must-have device for staying connected in the 1990s. Clipped to your waistband or belt, it would beep or vibrate, displaying a simple number on its tiny screen. Your cue to find the nearest payphone and call back. By 1994, pagers were everywhere, with over 61 million in use worldwide. Even teenagers had them, but that quickly led to controversy. Schools started banning them because they were unfairly associated with drug dealers and shady business. As cell phones from Nokia and Motorola became more affordable in the late 90s, pagers rapidly fell out of fashion. Once a status symbol, they were soon just another relic of pre-smartphone communication. Y2K Panic. As the year 2000 approached, the world braced for what many feared would be a technological disaster, Y2K. The problem? Early computer systems only used 2 digits to represent the year, meaning there was widespread concern that when the clock struck midnight on January 1st, 2000, computers would interpret 00 as 1900, causing massive system failures. Banks, airlines, hospitals, and power grids were all at risk, or so people thought. The uncertainty led to full-blown panic. Some withdrew cash, stocked up on food and water, and even prepared for power outages. But thanks to years of programming fixes and system upgrades, very little actually went wrong when the new millennium arrived. What was expected to be chaos turned out to be a global sigh of relief. Paper maps. Before GPS devices and smartphones made navigation effortless, road trips required a little more planning and a paper map. These large, foldable guides were a glove box essential, ready to be unfolded and never quite refolded the right way, whenever you needed directions. Whether it was a single state map or a full Rand McNally road atlas, these maps were the key to navigating the web of highways, interstates, and back roads across the country. If you missed a turn, there was no rerouting. You had to figure it out yourself. While paper maps still exist, they've become relics of a pre-digital era. Today, with Google and Apple Maps leading the way, most people wouldn't dream of using a paper map to get from point A to point B. Zima. In 1994, Coors introduced Zima, a clear, citrus-flavored malt beverage that aimed to revolutionize the alcohol market. Riding the wave of the clear drink trend, think Crystal Pepsi, Zima was positioned as a cool, modern alternative to beer. Coors poured a staggering $50 million into its first-year marketing campaign, and the investment initially paid off, with strong early sales. However, the drink struggled to find its audience. It was too light for beer drinkers, and its unique taste didn't quite catch on with the general public. By the late 90s, sales had plummeted, and by the early 2000s, Zima had vanished from store shelves. Though it made a brief comeback in 2017, it remains one of the more infamous beverage flops of the 90s. TGIF on ABC. For families in the 1990s, Friday nights meant one thing: TGIF on ABC. Unlike traditional kids programming, TGIF, thank goodness it's funny, was designed for everyone in the household. It was an event, bringing families together in front of the TV for a night of lighthearted sitcoms. Some of the most iconic shows of the decade, Full House, Family Matters, Boy Meets World, and Sabrina the Teenage Witch, became staples of this beloved lineup. Much like Disney's Sunday night movies in previous generations, TGIF created shared television moments that parents and kids could enjoy together. But as TV evolved, the block ended in 2000. Still, its legacy lives on, with many TGIF classics finding new life in streaming, and even modern reboots for today's audiences. Macarena. In 1996, a catchy beat and simple dance moves turned Macarena into a nationwide sensation. Originally a Spanish-language song, it exploded in popularity when the Bayside Boys released a remix featuring English lyrics. The song started in Miami's club scene but quickly spread like wildfire, eventually reaching the top of the US charts. When MTV aired the music video featuring its signature dance moves, everyone was doing the Macarena: kids, politicians, even nursing home residents. It was the dance craze of the decade, making its way into everything from sporting events to presidential rallies. VH1 later crowned it the greatest one-hit wonder of all time. Though its mainstream fame faded, the Macarena still lingers, living on at wedding receptions, school dances, and nostalgic 90s throwbacks. 1990s air travel. Flying in the 1990s was a completely different experience. Simpler, easier, and way less stressful. There were no long security lines, no shoe removal, and no limits on bringing your own food and drinks on board. Loved ones could walk you all the way to the gate and be waiting there when you landed. making arrivals and departures more personal and heartfelt. Airports felt more relaxed, and flying really did live up to the old slogan of the friendly skies. But all of that changed after the September 11th attacks in 2001. Security became much stricter, loved ones were banned from gate areas, and new airline fees made travel feel more like a hassle. The 1990s were the last decade of truly carefree air travel. 40 basic rights women did not have until the 1970s. You won't believe what women couldn't do before the 1970s. Imagine needing your husband's permission to open a bank account, get a credit card, or even file for divorce. Sounds crazy, right? But just a few decades ago, these were everyday struggles for women. From fighting for equal education to breaking into politics, the battle for basic rights was real. Stay tuned as we uncover the shocking things women were banned from doing. Some of them might surprise you. They wouldn't be acknowledged for running in the Boston Marathon. For decades, the Boston Marathon was strictly a men's event. Women weren't even allowed to register. That didn't stop Catherine Switzer in 1967. As a student at Syracuse University, she signed up using her initials, K.V. Switzer, and became the first woman to officially run the race. But when officials realized a woman was on the course, they tried to physically remove her. She was shoved, taunted, and spit on, yet she finished. It took 5 more years for women to be officially recognized. In 1972, Nina Kushik became the first acknowledged female winner, crossing the finish line in 3 hours, 10 minutes, and 26 seconds. They couldn't serve as a judge. While a few women held judicial positions before the 1970s, they were rare exceptions. It wasn't until the 1970s that most U.S. states began allowing women to serve as judges more regularly. Historically, the legal profession remained male-dominated, with barriers preventing women from ascending to the bench. Esther Morris became the first female justice of the peace in Wyoming in the 1870s, but progress was slow for nearly a century. Fortunately, the representation of female judges has steadily increased, leading to greater diversity and inclusion in the judiciary today. Women couldn't receive direct consultation about physical and mental health. Until the 1970s, many doctors refused to speak directly to women about their own medical conditions. Instead, they would discuss diagnoses and treatments with a woman's husband, father, or another male relative. The reasoning? Society believed women weren't capable of fully understanding medical information or making informed decisions about their health. This meant that even serious diagnoses, like cancer or mental health conditions, were often kept from women or filtered through a male figure. Over time, advocacy for women's rights in healthcare led to reforms, ensuring that women had the right to direct medical consultation and autonomy over their own bodies. Women could get fired for becoming pregnant. Before 1978, getting pregnant wasn't just a life-changing event. It could mean losing your job. Employers had the legal right to fire women simply for being pregnant, viewing them as unfit for work. There were no protections in place to prevent discrimination, leaving many women without income or job security during a crucial time in their lives. This changed with the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, which made it illegal to fire a woman solely because she was pregnant. However, it didn't guarantee paid leave or full job security, meaning many women still faced challenges balancing work and motherhood. Women couldn't receive the morning after pill. Before the 1970s, women had little to no access to emergency contraception. While the morning after pill became more available during that decade, it wasn't FDA approved until the late 1990s. Even then, women often had to seek it out discreetly due to societal stigma. Today, while access has improved, many still feel shame or embarrassment when obtaining emergency contraception, a lingering effect of decades of slow acceptance and restrictive policies regarding women's reproductive rights. Credit cards were not for women. Before 1974, financial independence was nearly impossible for many women. Something as simple as applying for a credit card wasn't a personal decision. It was a family affair. Banks had the legal right to reject women outright, or demand a male co-signer, whether it was a husband, father, or even a brother. A woman's financial credibility wasn't based on her own income or responsibility, but rather on a man's approval. This changed with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which finally made it illegal to deny credit based on gender. It was a crucial step toward true financial equality for women. Women didn't really have a voice. While women have always been able to speak, their opinions and concerns were often dismissed, particularly in professional and political spaces. Before the 1970s, men dominated decision-making in households, workplaces, and government, leaving women with little influence over their own lives. Even in matters concerning their health and rights, they were frequently expected to defer to their husbands or male authorities. However, as the women's rights movement gained momentum in the 1960s and 1970s, women began breaking barriers, demanding equal representation, and asserting their voices in politics, business, and personal matters. Women couldn't receive admittance into a military academy. Women have long played roles in war, but for most of U.S. history, they were barred from formal military training. Military academies, including West Point, refused to admit women, arguing they couldn't handle the physical and mental demands. That changed in 1976 when West Point finally opened its doors to female cadets. 4 years later, Andrea Holland and 61 other women made history as the first female graduates on May 28, 1980. However, their fight for equality wasn't over. Women were still banned from combat roles until 2013, when the Pentagon finally lifted the restriction. They didn't receive any paid maternity leave. Before the late 1960s, women who gave birth were often forced to leave their jobs without any financial support. In 1969, 5 states took the first step by ruling that women should be able to take maternity leave and receive some form of compensation. This led to the creation of the Temporary Disability Insurance Act, which allowed limited benefits for new mothers. However, this was far from a national solution. Decades later, paid maternity leave remains a struggle, with many workplaces in the U.S. still refusing to offer paid time off for new mothers, leaving them financially vulnerable. Interracial marriage was illegal in most states. Before 1967, many states banned interracial marriage, enforcing strict anti-miscegenation laws. The landmark Loving v. Virginia case changed this when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that prohibiting interracial marriage was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. Mildred and Richard Loving, an interracial couple from Virginia, were arrested and sentenced to prison for marrying. Their legal battle led to the nationwide legalization of interracial marriage, paving the way for a rise in interracial unions throughout the 1970s. Please comment 1 to let me know you'll be watching this video until the end. Women couldn't protect themselves from workplace sexual harassment. For years, women endured workplace sexual harassment with little to no legal protection. If they rejected unwanted advances, they could be demoted or even fired. That began to change in 1977, when the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia ruled that firing a woman for refusing sexual advances violated the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1980, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, officially defined sexual harassment, recognizing it as a form of workplace discrimination. The fight for justice continued, and in 1986, the U.S. Supreme Court reinforced this by confirming that sexual harassment created a hostile work environment. How do you think the progress women have made has influenced today's society? I'd love to hear your opinion. Females couldn't receive an equal education. For decades, women faced systemic discrimination in education. Before the late 1960s and early 1970s, many prestigious institutions, including Ivy League colleges and law schools, either barred women entirely or severely limited their opportunities. The prevailing belief among many men was that women were not intellectually capable of handling rigorous academic programs. Traditional gender roles further reinforced the idea that a woman's place was in the home rather than in higher education. These biases led to widespread inequality, limiting women's access to the same quality of education and career opportunities as their male counterparts. Girlfriends couldn't legally live with their boyfriends. Today, many couples live together before marriage without legal consequences, but this wasn't always the case. During the 1970s, several states still had laws prohibiting unmarried couples from cohabiting. These so-called fornication or cohabitation laws criminalized living together outside of marriage, often carrying fines or even jail time. While enforcement was inconsistent, the stigma remained strong. Over the years, societal attitudes shifted and legal barriers gradually fell. By 2013, all 50 states had officially repealed or stopped enforcing laws against unmarried couples living together, allowing cohabitation to become widely accepted in modern relationships. Divorce became quicker and easier. Before 1969, women seeking a divorce had to provide legal proof of their husband's wrongdoing, usually adultery, abuse, or abandonment. This often made divorces lengthy, difficult, and even impossible. The introduction of the No-Fault Divorce Act in 1969 changed everything, allowing couples to divorce without proving fault. This landmark law gave women greater autonomy, enabling them to leave unhappy marriages without the burden of legal battles. As a result, divorce rates increased, not necessarily because more marriages failed, but because women finally had the freedom to choose a way out. She couldn't be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Before the 1970s, the corporate world was dominated by men, and leadership roles in major companies were nearly inaccessible to women. It wasn't until 1972 that Katharine Graham shattered this barrier by becoming the first female CEO of a Fortune 500 company when she took over the Washington Post. While no law explicitly prevented women from holding such positions, deep-rooted gender biases and societal expectations kept them from advancing to top executive roles. Graham's leadership paved the way for future female executives, proving that women could excel at the highest levels of corporate America. They couldn't celebrate International Women's Day. By the 1970s, women around the world were demanding equal rights, but in the U.S., even something as simple as celebrating International Women's Day wasn't officially recognized. While the day had been observed in other countries since the early 1900s, it was largely ignored in America. That began to change in the mid-1970s as the fight for gender equality gained momentum. In 1980, President Jimmy Carter took it a step further, officially declaring a National Women's History Week, which included March 8th, International Women's Day. It was a long overdue acknowledgement of women's contributions and their ongoing struggle for equality. They couldn't be a part of all Olympic Games. While women have made significant strides in sports, their participation in the Olympic Games was once extremely limited. Although female athletes began competing in the early 1900s, their representation and event options remained restricted for decades. The 1970s marked a turning point, with the 1976 Olympics introducing ice dancing, basketball, rowing, and handball for women. Even so, progress remained slow. Women weren't allowed to compete in Olympic boxing until 2012. Despite these challenges, female athletes continue to break barriers and expand their presence in the world's most prestigious sporting event. Women couldn't be astronauts. Before the 1970s, NASA's selection criteria effectively barred women from becoming astronauts. the agency required candidates to be military test pilots, roles that were closed to women at the time. This exclusion meant that no women could even apply. That changed in 1979 when NASA began accepting female candidates for astronaut training. Just 4 years later, in 1983, Sally Ride made history as the first American woman to travel to space, paving the way for future generations of female astronauts. They were scarce in D.C. Before the 1970s, women in politics were a rarity. While a handful held local or national positions, the political arena remained overwhelmingly male. However, the late 1960s and early 1970s marked a turning point, with more women running for office and securing seats in Congress. By 1970, about a dozen women served in Congress, signaling a growing shift toward female representation. Women also began making their mark in local politics, proving their influence extended beyond the household and into governance. Which of these 40 shocking things women couldn't do until the 1970s surprised you the most? Let me know. She couldn't refuse sex from her husband. Before the 1970s, a wife had no legal right to refuse sex with her husband. The law did not recognize marital rape, as marriage was seen as granting permanent consent. Some state courts began acknowledging the issue in the 1970s, but legal action against spousal rape remained rare. It wasn't until the Violence Against Women Act of 1994 that federal protections were established, criminalizing domestic violence, including spousal rape. Before this, law enforcement often dismissed abuse within marriage as a private matter, leaving countless women trapped in abusive relationships without legal recourse. They couldn't have their own mind. Before the 1970s, women were often expected to conform to societal roles dictated by men, limiting their independence in many aspects of life. While they had their own thoughts and ambitions, their opinions were frequently dismissed, especially in financial and professional matters. Many needed their husband's permission to open a bank account, apply for a credit card, or even pursue a job. The idea that women should focus solely on household duties reinforced the belief that their decisions weren't as valuable as men's. It wasn't until the women's rights movements of the 1970s that these restrictions began to change. Women couldn't own a bank. Before the 1970s, women had limited career opportunities, especially in the financial sector. However, this began to change, with the decade marking a turning point for women in banking and finance. In 1975, the first women's bank opened in New York City, becoming the first bank owned and operated by a woman for women. While initially met with skepticism, the bank remained open and became a landmark achievement in the women's rights movement. This milestone symbolized a shift toward financial independence and greater professional opportunities for women in the business world. Women couldn't serve on a jury. Before the 1970s, women were often excluded from jury duty because individual states had the power to decide whether they could serve. Many states believed that women were too emotional or delicate to handle the responsibilities of jury service, and some even assumed that legal matters were too complex for them to understand. As a result, women were rarely selected, and in some places, they were completely prohibited from participating. This inequality remained until 1973, when all 50 states officially required women to be included in jury pools, marking a major milestone in the fight for gender equality in the legal system. They couldn't obtain a degree in women's studies. Before the late 1960s, women's history and gender studies were largely absent from academic institutions. While the first women's studies program emerged in Australia in 1956, it took over a decade for the movement to gain traction in the United States. Cornell University introduced the first women's studies classes in 1969, and in 1970, San Diego State University established the country's first official women's studies program. By 1972, feminist studies had become an academic discipline, leading to the formation of the National Women's Studies Association in 1977, which helped integrate women's history into higher education curricula. She couldn't divorce over domestic violence. Before the 1970s, women faced immense legal hurdles when seeking a divorce, even in cases of domestic violence. Courts required wives to provide concrete proof of wrongdoing, but spousal abuse was often dismissed as a private matter rather than grounds for separation. While adultery was generally accepted as a valid reason for divorce, domestic violence wasn't widely recognized as justification until the late 20th century. It wasn't until the 1970s that women could begin filing for divorce due to abuse, and true legal protections against domestic violence didn't take full effect until the 1990s. They struggled to get a birth control pill. Although the FDA approved birth control pills in the 1960s, many states imposed strict regulations, making it difficult for women to obtain them. In Connecticut, activist Estelle Griswold was arrested for providing contraception, leading to the landmark Supreme Court case Griswold v. Connecticut, 1965, which granted married women the right to access birth control. It wasn't until the 1970s that more states eased restrictions, finally allowing doctors to prescribe the pill more freely. Ladies couldn't easily practice law. For nearly a century, women struggled to enter the legal profession. While some had broken barriers as lawyers and judges, they remained rare in the field until the late 1960s and early 1970s. A study by Cornell University found that 90% of law firms refused to interview female applicants, and many law schools denied women admission. This widespread discrimination made it difficult for women to establish legal careers, but by the 1970s, more institutions and firms began opening their doors, paving the way for greater gender equality in law. Likewise, they couldn't serve on the Supreme Court. The 1970s marked a turning point for women in the legal profession, as more law schools admitted female students, and women gained the right to serve on juries and practice law. Despite these advancements, no woman had ever been appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. That changed in 1981, when Sandra Day O'Connor became the first female Supreme Court justice, breaking a centuries-old barrier. She served until 2006, paving the way for future justices. Since then, other women, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan, have held seats on the nation's highest court. They wouldn't be admitted into an Ivy League university. For decades, Ivy League universities prioritized male education, making it difficult for women to gain admission. While some elite institutions had affiliated women's colleges, most Ivy League schools remained male-only until the late 1960s and beyond. Yale and Princeton opened their doors to women in 1969, followed by others at a slow pace. Harvard fully integrated women from Radcliffe College in 1977, and Columbia University was the last to admit women in 1983. This shift marked a major step toward gender equality in higher education. Women couldn't breastfeed in public. Before the 1970s, breastfeeding in public wasn't just controversial, it was outright discouraged and often prohibited. Many businesses and public spaces refused to accommodate nursing mothers, fearing it would make others uncomfortable. This led to widespread discrimination against women who chose to breastfeed outside their homes. However, as awareness of women's rights grew, so did the fight for breastfeeding equality. Eventually, legal protections were established, and Congress passed laws preventing discrimination against nursing mothers. Today, while debates continue, laws in all 50 states protect a woman's right to breastfeed in public without fear of legal consequences. Women weren't able to get any job. Before the 1970s, career opportunities for women were extremely limited. Most employers only considered women for traditional roles like secretaries, teachers, or nurses, while higher-paying or leadership positions remained male-dominated. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 aimed to eliminate workplace discrimination, but enforcement was weak, and many companies found ways to bypass the law. Some employers simply ignored female applicants, while others justified rejections with unrelated excuses. As the women's rights movement gained momentum in the 1970s, legal and social pressures slowly opened doors to a wider range of professions for women. They cared more about education than marriage. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, women began shifting their focus from early marriage to higher education and career advancement. Previously, many young women married right out of high school, as opportunities for higher education were limited. However, as Ivy League colleges started admitting women and more female professionals emerged, education became a viable path. This shift marked a turning point, allowing women to pursue degrees and careers before settling down, ultimately reshaping societal expectations. Women couldn't open a bank account. Before the 1970s, women faced significant financial restrictions, including the inability to open a bank account without a husband's or male guardian's approval. Just as they needed a man's signature for a credit card, banks often required male consent for account ownership. This was rooted in the belief that women lacked the financial knowledge or responsibility to manage money independently. However, as the women's rights movement gained momentum, laws changed, allowing women to take full control of their finances. By the mid-1970s, financial independence for women became a reality, marking a crucial step toward gender equality. Do you think we've made enough progress, or is there still more work to be done for gender equality? Let's discuss in the comments. Women couldn't purchase athletic shoes. Today, women's athletic shoes are a standard part of the sports industry, but that wasn't the case until the late 1970s and early 1980s. Before this time, shoe manufacturers didn't consider women a target market for sports footwear. With limited opportunities in athletics, women had to settle for buying men's shoes, which often didn't fit properly. As women's participation in sports grew, helped by Title IX in 1972, companies like Nike and Adidas finally began producing athletic shoes designed specifically for women, marking a major shift in both the sports industry and gender equality in athletics. Women couldn't discuss sex openly. Before the 1970s, openly discussing sex was considered taboo for women. While private conversations among friends may have occurred, public discussions about sexuality were often frowned upon. Though not illegal, societal expectations discouraged women from speaking about their experiences or desires. The shift began with the rise of the feminist movement, and books like The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan helped challenge these restrictions. By the late 20th century, women's voices in discussions about sexuality, reproductive rights, and relationships became more accepted, breaking decades of silence and paving the way for more open conversations. They couldn't adopt a baby as a single woman. Before the 1970s, adoption laws heavily favored traditional family structures, making it nearly impossible for single women to adopt a child, despite the fact that many women were the primary caregivers in households. Lawmakers and adoption agencies insisted that a child needed both a mother and a father. Even if a single woman was financially stable, emotionally capable, and fully prepared to provide a loving home, her marital status often disqualified her from adopting. It wasn't until the women's rights movement gained traction in the 1970s that these outdated restrictions began to change, allowing single women the opportunity to adopt. Women fought for the right to protest. Before the late 1960s and early 1970s, women rarely organized large-scale protests, and when they did, they often faced hostility from both men and other women. However, the feminist movement gained momentum in the 1970s, with increasing numbers of women, and even some men, joining demonstrations for gender equality. These protests expanded beyond issues like workplace discrimination and reproductive rights, addressing broader social injustices. Women's activism during this era helped solidify their right to protest and paved the way for future movements advocating for equality and justice. They did rally against the Miss America pageant. In 1968, women from across the United States gathered to protest the Miss America pageant, arguing that it reduced women to objects rather than recognizing them as individuals. Demonstrators criticized the pageant for promoting sexism and unrealistic beauty standards. This protest became a defining moment in the women's liberation movement, setting the stage for the continued fight for gender equality in the 1970s. Women demanded to be seen as more than just their appearance. They wanted recognition for their intelligence, talents, and contributions to society. Women couldn't legally get an abortion for any reason. The debate over abortion rights has been ongoing for decades, but before 1970, the law was clear. Abortion was illegal in most states, with no exceptions. Women facing dangerous pregnancies, assault, or personal hardships had no legal options. That changed when a young Texas woman, known by the pseudonym Jane Roe, took a stand. She sued Dallas County District Attorney Henry Wade, arguing that women had a constitutional right to abortion. Her case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1973, the landmark Roe v. Wade ruling struck down state bans, ensuring women had the right to choose. Organizations started focusing on enforcing work equality for women. Even after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it illegal to discriminate based on gender or race, many employers ignored the law, and women continued to face unequal pay, limited job opportunities, and workplace harassment. By the 1970s, frustration was mounting, and organizations like the National Organization for Women, NOW, stepped up to demand enforcement of these laws. They pressured companies, challenged unfair hiring practices, and fought for fair treatment. While progress has been made, workplace discrimination remains a challenge, with women still earning less than men on average and often facing harassment in male-dominated industries. Did we miss one of your favorite lost treasures from the past? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, check out more videos in this series. Don't forget to subscribe and share Who Remembers with a fellow nostalgia lover. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.